If you were a Dragon Ball fan before the airing of Super, I'm sure you typed, "I miss the way Dragon Ball used to look," or "Dragon Ball Z looks better than Super," or something like that. Well, I can't lie, I do too. But that isn't me saying Dragon Ball Super just looks awful. It's actually far from it. My affinity for the art style during the 90s is purely subjective because I can admit that Dragon Ball Super has moments where the art is on another level. So in this video, I'm going to do my best to detail the evolution of Dragon Ball's art style, and at the end of the video, I'm going to tell you which style was my favorite and why. But before I start, I want to highlight that this will not be about animation. There will be many names mentioned in this video that were animation directors for the various Dragon Ball series, but they won't be mentioned for their skill in animation, but for their skill in drawing the world of Dragon Ball. Now, there have been many individuals who have drawn official works for the Dragon Ball franchise, but in my opinion, there are 8 who have an impact on the franchise's art style far more profound than the rest. Those 8 are Akira Toriyama, Minoru Maeda, Masayuki Uchiyama, Tatoshi Yamamuro, Katsuyoshi Nakatsuru, Yuya Takahashi, Naohiro Shintani, and Tetsuro Kodama. Hope I said all those names right. My goal is to show the stylistic evolution, so it is only right that I start with the first series and its creator, Akira Toriyama. He started all of this. He's responsible for drawing and writing the story that we all love. Dragon Ball started in 1984, and Toriyama's style then was much more rounded than it would be later on. Of course, Goku was a child for majority of the story, and children normally have more rounded and softer facial features than adults. But even after Goku grew up, there is still a clear difference in how Toriyama would draw those faces in Dragon Ball versus Dragon Ball Z. This may just be me, but I also think Toriyama would draw his mouths much bigger than he would later on. Again, that could be me just focusing on Goku, and maybe his mouth appeared smaller because the rest of his head grew. I don't know. Let me know in the comments what you think about that one. Toriyama during this time wouldn't draw as many folds in clothing, and there wasn't a ton of shading that went along with that. Speaking of shading, there would normally be 2 tones with the occasional hatching for some characters, and as you'll see later in this video, that is one of the more noticeable differences when examining how Dragon Ball's art style has changed. The next person responsible for Dragon Ball's art style during that time is Minoru Maeda, the chief animation director for Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z up until the Cell arc. I think he did a good job of bringing Toriyama's work to the screen. Of course, there were subtle changes that became more clear as Dragon Ball went on because Toriyama's style began to change as he went towards a more angular style of drawing, and Maeda continued with his rounded style. But like I said before, I think he did a good job overall. And then there's Masayuki Uchiyama, the animation director for the first 2 Dragon Ball series. I'm trying my best not to be mean, but he wasn't too good. His work is more glaringly off-model in Dragon Ball Z, but it is noticeable in Dragon Ball as well. But credit to him for getting the job done and directing more than 25% of all of the episodes between Dragon Ball Z, and Dragon Ball GT. Even though he was not a more consistent director for the series, I do want to give a shout out to Masaki Sato, who was responsible for some of the best drawn moments in the first 2 series and did a fantastic job of staying consistent with Toriyama's always changing art style. Now, moving into Dragon Ball Z, I'll start with Akira Toriyama again. But this time I have to highlight the changes because Saiyan Arc Toriyama and Buu Arc Toriyama had 2 very different styles. The more angular approach that he ended Dragon Ball with flowed right into Dragon Ball Z. Goku's hair during the Saiyan saga is noticeably more curved than during the Cell and Buu arcs. The same could be said for Vegeta as well. Toriyama would draw many more folds in his clothing, and with that would bring more shading. On the topic of shading, we see a lot more hatching from Toriyama in Dragon Ball Z. And then for his normal 2 tones of shading, it would take up far more space on the skin than it would in Dragon Ball. Although they didn't make it to the manga, Toriyama did begin drawing characters with skin and hair highlights much more often after 1991-92 in work outside of the manga. And those kind of highlights have become a topic of contention with many fans of the franchise. Fans often blame another artist who will later be mentioned in this video, but I do want to make it clear that it was something Toriyama did before as well. Minoru Maeda made some appearances in Dragon Ball Z, and again, he did just a solid job. I don't believe he did anything extraordinarily positive or negative in his work with Dragon Ball Z. It was just clear that his rounded style was drifting further and further away from the direction Toriyama was headed in. But Masayuki Uchiyama, man, he's bad in Dragon Ball Z. Every time you saw a character who was way off model in Dragon Ball Z, it's likely that Masayuki Uchiyama was responsible. His eyes were never right, the proportion of his facial features were off, and the hair, the hair was bad. And the thing that would always make it stick out more is that the episode before one he would direct would look much better. I know it's supposed to be that way, but he never directed 2 episodes in a row, so his work was always jarring. There were other bad artists for Dragon Ball Z, but Uchiyama directed so many episodes that I think he deserves to make this video. I can let you know now that he won't be the person I claim to be my favorite at the end of this video. I want to give another quick shout out to Masaki Sato, who wasn't the director for many episodes like Maeda or Uchiyama, but when he was, he stood out. Keisuke Masunaga is also responsible for some iconic shots from the Buu arc. I'm not the biggest fan of his work, but I definitely think he deserves mention. There's also Junior Furusawa, who never worked on the anime but is responsible for some outstanding promotional material. And then there's the constantly controversial Tatoshi Yamamuro. He is the person who is responsible for how Dragon Ball has looked for the last 20 plus years. Whether it was a video game cover, promotional material, and most famously Dragon Ball Super, Yamamuro is the one responsible. But Yamamuro has actually been a key piece in every single Dragon Ball anime, but I don't think we really get to see his style shine bright until Dragon Ball Z. Now, he took over as the character designer during the Cell arc, but his contributions to the series could be seen much before that. He was responsible for some beautiful drawings during Goku's fight with Frieza and Goku's first encounter with Future Trunks. But I think Tatoshi Yamamuro's standout trait is his shading. It's something that people still talk about today. I don't know for sure if he was the first, but he was definitely the person that popularized the three-tone shading in Dragon Ball Z. He also used to have this funny cheek shading pattern. It wasn't very long-lived, but definitely a defining trait of his during that time. The biggest compliment I can give Tatoshi Yamamuro is that when I think of a Super Saiyan from Dragon Ball Z, it is likely an image that Yamamuro was responsible for. Next, there's Katsuyoshi Nakatsuru. Like Yamamuro, he worked on every Dragon Ball series and became a character designer during the Cell arc. He's responsible for some of the most iconic moments in Dragon Ball Z, including Future Trunks' first Super Saiyan transformation in the history of Trunks, Future Trunks' first appearance, Goku's sacrifice against Cell, and the Bardock special. He and Yamamuro were the two that followed Toriyama's art style change throughout the Buu arc the best, and has some similar shading tendencies, even though I think Yamamuro was slightly more detailed on that front. Nakatsuru was also responsible for the first time I can remember the highlights being a big part of an episode with episode 120, which I believe is one of, if not the greatest looking episode of Dragon Ball Z. Like I said before, Nakatsuru and Yamamuro really took over after Cell, and I think they are the best two artists that worked on the Dragon Ball Z anime on a consistent basis. But this duo is also responsible for Dragon Ball GT. Before, I mentioned how Toriyama's art style was constantly evolving by the time we got to the Buu arc. I mean, just look at how Piccolo changed from the beginning of Z to the end. Anyways, Toriyama began drawing his characters with a large jawline and chin where you can see that they were much more angular and pointed early in the series. Well, that trend was one that Yamamuro and Nakatsuru carried into Dragon Ball GT, but they kept it going even further. The GT jawlines are even more curved, the jawlines get longer, and the chins become enormous. Yamamuro and Nakatsuru also began drawing characters' noses a bit larger as well, but those aren't aspects I was turned off by. I have never been a fan of the highlights on the skin and hair in anime form, and that made its way into Dragon Ball GT. On the positive side, Nakatsuru is responsible for designing Super Saiyan 4 and the last scene of Dragon Ball GT, which I love. And then there's the time between the end of GT and the start of Super. Toriyama's art style during this period is a far cry from his work with Dragon Ball or Dragon Ball Z. He began to draw his characters a lot slimmer, they had more rounded edges, and even more lines with the Super Saiyan hair than before. A lot of the hatching that he used to do was no longer a factor, and his color palette for Dragon Ball was definitely different. And on the other hand, Yamamuro was taking the franchise in a completely different direction. He began using three-tone shading along with highlights, which I hate. His color palette changed as well to colors that pop a lot more, but his work during that time felt stiff because of the shape of his shading. Yes, this applies to Super, but I'm also referring to Dragon Ball Z moments that Yamamuro redrew that just don't compare to the original. As for anything modern Dragon Ball, Tatoshi Yamamuro is a big reason as to why it looks the way it does, and that's the case for most of Super. But I do want to highlight the Tournament of Power because that is where the art took a big shift. The line work had much more variation, the color palette was different, and I think the art just had an overall higher quality than the rest of Super. And the artist I want to highlight for this is Yuya Takahashi. He brought back a style that Yamamuro popularized during Dragon Ball Z. Episodes directed by Takahashi are loved by many fans, and we saw his style even make its way into the Dragon Ball Super Broly movie. And speaking of the Broly movie, there's now Hiro Shintani. Shintani's style in Broly was such a breath of fresh air. We got a new color palette, a much different and less complex shading style, along with toning down a lot of the details that we saw in Yamamuro's work with arms and neck specifically. Shintani's style reminds me a lot of Toriyama's style in early to mid Dragon Ball. I mean, just look at the difference here. Yamamuro's Goku feels stiff. I never understood how Goku's hands could be at his side like that, but his biceps face the viewer. Anyway, Shintani's style is great, and I would love if we saw more of it in the future. Like Shintani, Tetsuro Kodama doesn't have much of a track record with Dragon Ball, as his only work is Superhero, but the style he used in that movie was a controversial topic for the fan base. Personally, I like it. I enjoy the natural feel that his shading has, but I don't think it would be my preference in an anime. But after I've said all of that, and going through all the talented artists who have worked on Dragon Ball, my favorite has to be Masaki Sato. I think his line work is second to none in the franchise, and he was always on model. Sato does have some key animation credits in a couple of the Dragon Ball Z movies, but his work with the anime is few and far between, and that's my only gripe. I wish he did more. I would have loved to see Sato's work in the Buu arc or GT. Tatoshi Yamamuro was a close second because I think he was the most consistent artist in Dragon Ball Z, and the way he drew Super Saiyans around the Frieza and Android arcs is nothing short of fantastic. But I'm not a fan of a lot of his work since the end of GT, and that's something I just can't get past. But with that being said, if you enjoyed this video, please click the like button and let me know in the comments who your favorite artist in Dragon Ball is and why. If this is your first time on the channel, subscribe so you know when I upload more videos like this. But until then, this is BigTune, and thanks for watching. Y'all have a good one.